Hello, everyone. I'm Charles Powell, and welcome to another edition of Religion in 60 Minutes. Today's topic, Healing a Wounded World, Voices from the Baha'i Tradition. A few questions to consider. How is the world going to change? Could it be that it is going to change one heart at a time? Today's panel is presented by the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, and it is co-sponsored by the University of Notre Dame's Clough Institute for Civil and Human Rights, the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies, and the Department of American Studies. And we thank them for their support. Humankind has long struggled with afflictions such as war, racism, gender inequality. Today, despite progress, these scourges persist, and they disproportionately harm marginalized communities, preventing our human family from advancing dignity for all. The Ansari Institute engages normative perspectives from the world's many religious, spiritual, and secular traditions on these particular topics and many more. Today, we welcome voices from the Baha'i tradition. Founded in the 19th century, this tradition teaches the essential worth of all religions and the unity of all people. The founder of the faith, Baha'u'llah, called for harmonious relations between the world's religions and nations. The Baha'i faith. The Baha'i faith is the world's newest independent global belief system, and it teaches the oneness of God, the unity of humanity, and the essential harmony of religion. It is the world's second most widespread religion after Christianity, spanning the globe and working to unite it. The Baha'i teachings promote the agreement of science and religion, gender equality, as well as the elimination of all prejudice and racism. Baha'is believe in each person's capacity to find the truth for themselves. There is no clergy. Baha'is gather together in democratically led communities, and they welcome everyone. Baha'is accept the validity of each of the founders and prophets of the major world religions, and they believe in progressive revelation. This unique Baha'i principle views every great faith as a link in a single spiritual system, progressively revealed, similar to how chapters in a book tell an evolving story by God to humanity. Some questions that come to mind. What can this tradition teach us today? How might it help us better understand the oneness of humanity? And how might we draw on its perspectives as we work toward a more just and equitable world? To speak to these questions and more, I am joined today by three scholars and practitioners of the Baha'i faith. You'll notice on the screen we have Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi. Dr. Mahmoudi specializes in religion and peace studies. Since July 2012, she has held the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland. She has published extensively. Some of her research and writings include Structural Racism and the Roots of Prejudice, A World Without War, Fundamental Challenges to Global Peace and Security, as well as Systemic Racism in America, Sociological Theory, Educational Inequality, and Social Change. Additionally, she has a few research themes that explore the empowerment of women and peace, global governance and leadership, human nature, and overcoming challenges in the globalization of the environment, all of which explore ways to promote innovative ideas and strategies for a more peaceful world. Dr. Mahmoudi, welcome to the conversation. Please share with us, where are you joining us from today?
Thank you so much, Dr. Powell, for that introduction. I reside currently in Washington, D.C., and I am, of course, at the University of Maryland.
Next, I'm joined by Dr. June Manning Thomas. Dr. Thomas writes about diversification of the planning profession, planning history, and social equity in neighborhoods and urban revitalization. Her recent research explored the relationship between the concept of social equity and the civil rights movement, and examined the land use reactions of community organizations to vacant land in Detroit. Her books include the co-edited Urban Planning and the African American Community in the Shadows. Another one is Redevelopment and Race, Planning a Finer City in Post-War Detroit. Another one is Planning Progress, Lessons from Shogi Effendi. And if I pronounce one of these names incorrectly, please do correct me, okay? But she co-edited The City After Abandonment and the co-edited Mapping Detroit, Evolving Land Use Patterns and Connections. Her latest book is the semi-autobiographical Struggling to Learn: An Intimate History of School Desegregation in South Carolina. Previously, as a professor at Michigan State University, she developed statewide initiatives to link urban planning services on campus with community development needs in Michigan cities. Dr. Thomas, welcome to the conversation, and please share with us, where are you joining us from today?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I am joining you from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Beautiful city. Thank you for being with us. And next I have Dr. Robert Stockman. Robert, I've never been this close to anyone in a panel such as this.
Small table.
It is. Dr. Stockman has been researching and teaching about the Baha'i faith for more than half of his life. I won't tell you how long that has been. I'll let him tell you that. He became fascinated with American Baha'i history and with the first American Baha'i, Thornton Chase, which I learned died on the same day I was born, just different date, but September 30th.
Years, fortunately.
This interest led him to switch his academic field in 1980 from planetary science to history of religion in the United States. In 1990, as Rob was finishing his doctorate in history of religion in the United States at Harvard University, he drew up plans to create a Baha'i Studies Institute that would offer courses, encourage research, as well as publish. But instead, he was hired by the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States to start a research office at their National Baha'i headquarters in Wilmette, Illinois. Illinois. I think down south we still say Illinois, and we still go to the Walmarts from time to time. But some of the responsibilities of the research office led to the creation of the Wilmette Institute. Dr. Stockman remains active in academia, teaching religious studies part-time at DePaul University in Chicago and currently at Indiana University, South Bend. He has published 4 books on aspects of Baha'i history, including a biography of Thornton Chase and 1 introductory textbook on the faith. Dr. Robert Stockman, welcome to the conversation. Very pleased to have you in person, and we're also very pleased to have you as faculty affiliate at the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be able to be of assistance to Ansari.
Thank you. I'd like to begin with a prayer from Baha'u'llah, and then am I saying that correctly? Baha'u'llah. Maybe we can say it together.
Baha'u'llah.
Okay. That was not a name I was familiar with growing up in the South either. That's something new. But a prayer that he shared. Thy name is my healing, O my God, and remembrance of thee is my remedy. Nearness to thee is my hope, and love for thee is my companion. Thy mercy to me is my healing and my succor in both this world and the world to come. Thou verily art the all-beautiful, the all-knowing, the all-wise. Amen? Do you say amen?
We don't, but you can.
What do you say at the end?
Well, we usually say Baha'u'llah or Abdul Baha, depending on who revealed it. We just leave it at that.
Amen.
Amen.
Very good.
Amen.
So I'm going to ask you, Rob, if you would begin the conversation for us today. I'd like for you to introduce the audience who may or may not be perplexed with the faith to the history of the Baha'i faith and to the first American Baha'i, Thornton Chase. I have to note that if you go to Wikipedia, you will discover at once that one of the primary contributors to this individual, Thornton Chase, is you, Dr. Robert Stockman. You are the scholar on this, and we're happy to have you with us. And so tell us about Officer Thornton Chase, and tell us the story a bit
Sure.
about the Baha'i faith.
Sure. Well, I don't want to spend a lot of time about Thornton Chase. He's a fascinating character, especially for me. He became a Baha'i in 1894, June 1894 in Chicago. He was a 47-year-old life insurance executive who had been always interested in world religions. And he came across a Baha'i from what we today would call Lebanon, who was there actually telling people about the Baha'i faith. And he was one of a group of 4 or 5 people who all accepted the faith there in mid-1894. This resulted in a Baha'i community, a sort of nucleus in Chicago that by 1900, there were about 700 Baha'is in Chicago and about 1,500 in the United States. And from that nucleus, the American Baha'i community continued to grow until today we're at 178,000 in the United States. We just broke 178,000. I noticed that on our database about a month ago. So in terms of the history, though, that was already 50 years after the beginning of the Baha'i faith in Iran. There are 2 individuals we consider to have been messengers of God who brought revelation to humanity, the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Their dates are 1819 to 1850 and 1817 to 1892. So they're both 19th century figures. They both were raised Iranian Shiites. And I'll really focus mostly on Baha'u'llah because the Bab was his forerunner and passed away fairly quickly. He was martyred in 1850. Baha'u'llah devoted his life to revealing a new message from God. He was very fortunate to live at a time when there was widespread literacy, where people could read and write. He provided over 6 million words of texts that we have today that exist in our archives in Haifa, Israel, at our Baha'i World Center. And in those texts, there are statements about just about everything you can imagine, from how to set interest rates, to whether to do music, to how to raise babies, to how to bring about world peace. We heard a prayer of his, so there are prayers. There are certain laws of the faith as well, such as obligatory prayer. So we pray every day individually. We don't pray congregationally like Muslims do. And there's a fast. The fast, by the way, starts on Thursday, and I'm glad you did not move this any later, since those of us in the audience here would not be able to have any lunch. The fast runs from sunrise to sunset for 19 days in the month of March. And it ends with the first day of spring, which of course is this year's the 21st of March. That's a holy day called Nowruz, or New Year's. And we have fun then too. So that's a very quick summary of Baha'u'llah. His son, Abdul Baha, became his successor. Baha'u'llah appointed Abdul Baha his successor. He was able to come to the United States in 1912 and also went to Europe. And we have 5 million words from Abdul Baha. They were all very, very active writers. And they wrote in Arabic and Persian. Baha'u'llah wrote poetry. He wrote mystical compositions. He wrote legal texts. Truly an enormous variety of things. Abdul Baha was the authorized interpreter and provided interpretation. And since he came to the West and people asked him all kinds of questions from a Western perspective, he provided that whole dimension of understanding to the faith as well. And then his successor, Shoghi Effendi, who was educated at Oxford, was able to translate these things into English, and since he was the authorized interpreter, Shoghi Effendi's translations are authorized text as well. And he also wrote 5 million words. So we don't have a Bible. We have a scripture database, you might say. And I have on my shelf this many books, I think, by Baha'u'llah, an equal number by Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi, and we only have about 5% of Baha'u'llah available in English. So there's an immense amount of guidance there. And the Baha'i faith is very much a religion of the word, of the written word, and of the scripture that way. If we have additional questions today, we write the Universal House of Justice, which is our worldwide governing body elected every 5 years. And they will provide answers to questions, they provide guidance, direct us, recommend things to us, advise us, love us. They really provide a lot of loving guidance as well. And if you ask them a personal dilemma, maybe they'll answer it, or maybe they'll say, you'll have to decide yourself. Because that's the way it has to be.
And we have several members, do you say members of the Baha'i community here with us today?
Yes.
Baha'is, so welcome. We're very glad that you are here with us talking about this very important topic. Thank you for encouraging them to come as well.
Yes. Sure.
You're a keeper. You help fill the room up.
Glad to.
So thank you for that bit of history. And of course, towards the end of the time we have together today, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions as well. The way the flow will go, I'll ask Dr. Stockman a question, and then we'll go to Dr. Mahmoudi or Dr. Hoda, okay? So I would like to go ahead now and ask a question to Dr. Mahmoudi. First of all, you have recently co-authored a book with Dr. Janet Khan. The title of the book is A World Without War. Imagine that. Mahan Mirza, the executive director of the Ansari Institute, often encourages us in staff meetings, and I believe he encourages his students as well. Think about the world not as it is, but the world as it should be, or the world as it possibly could be. But I want to invite you to take us on a journey. What does the Baha'i faith have to say about the implementation of peace? Help us to imagine, help us to realize a world without war.
Yes, as you mentioned, the book was predominantly focused on the discourses of Abdul Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, because he, in his teachings, in his writings, as he's interpreting his father's teachings, has so much to say about the implementation of peace, which I would say is the overarching goal of the Baha'i faith. So he was actually in the period of the turn of the century, the past century, just before World War I, Abdul Baha was quite engaged with the world, traveling in Europe and in the United States, talking to all kinds of organizations, but among them, peace organizations, because there was a large movement, peace movement, before World War I. And so, the book examines what Abdul Baha's writings say about the implementation of peace in the world. And so I want to focus a little bit on what that implementation means. How do we imagine a world without war? So first of all, I think we have to do more than just imagine. And I think this is one of the key components of Abdul Baha's writings, where he says there are things that we must do, we must act, we must constantly be engaged in activities, in generating knowledge, in experimentation with how to bring about a more peaceful world. And for example, here's his own statement that I think clarifies this implementation even further. So in Abdul Baha's words, he says, today the benefits of universal peace are recognized amongst the people. And likewise, the harmful effects of war are clear and manifest to all. But in this matter, knowledge alone is far from sufficient. a power of implementation is needed to establish it. In other words, to establish peace throughout the world. You should therefore consider how the compelling power of conscience can be awakened, so that this lofty ideal may be translated from the realm of thought into that of reality. The power of conscience is therefore needed, and spiritual sentiments are required, that souls may feel compelled to evince a goodly character. And then he says, it's our firm belief that the power of implementation in this great endeavor is the penetrating power of the Word of God and the confirmations of the Holy Spirit. So I think that's a very important statement, which basically tells us that we must make every attempt to achieve unity amongst ourselves by seeking love, justice, steadfastness, and selflessness. Only then can we embark on a journey towards the construction of institutions, systems that are capable of attending to the myriad and complex needs of people in every corner of this world. Also, such a major transformation does not mean that there will not be conflict in human affairs. The Baha'is are not Pollyannish about this. There will always be conflict in human affairs, but it's how we resolve those conflicts. And Abdu'l-Baha reminds us that we must first come together and discuss principles, ethical notions that we agree upon. And then we need to, once we have decided on those principles and ethical considerations, then we must act upon them through unity of thought and action. So part of the imagination of a new world begins realizing the nature of the world itself, the nature of we ourselves as human beings. The Baha'i faith is very realistic about humanity's dark side, about the hatred, antagonism, and bloodshed that exists in the world. But we also believe that these truths are caused by a kind of fundamental spiritual ignorance that can be ameliorated. Because we believe this, we view what may be called prejudices of religion, race, gender, economic, that these prejudices are actually the fundamental barriers to peace. This is extremely important because the Baha'i faith really, and Abdu'l-Baha's writings elaborate on this, that prejudice becomes the barrier to peace, and that it's these barriers that separate people, that cause some group of people to consider themselves superior to others, and then they act upon this prejudice, and that's where a lot of our conflict, contention, bloodshed, inequalities, whatever emerges. It's the barriers that separate the people of the world from one another. And we believe that the removal of such prejudices or barriers will lead to an ever increasing unity over time among individuals and structures in society. Shall I go on, or?
I would very much like for you to go on, but I think this does lead us into a question that I have for Dr. Thomas as well. On February the 8th, 1968, again, picture unity and then picture segregation. February the 8th, 1968, some South Carolina Highway Patrol officers in Orangeburg, South Carolina, opened fire on protesters on the South Carolina State University campus. 3 of the protesters, African American males, were killed and 28 protesters were injured. In 1964, the year that President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, you, Dr. Thomas, attended the local white high school in Orangeburg. Orangeburg holds a very special place in your life story. I wonder, can you talk about the Orangeburg massacre of 1968 and how did that influence your view of religion? Moreover, how did it affect your view of the world? And did it affect your decision to promote racial unity in your life's work?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry we don't have an hour. I could talk about those things perhaps in an hour. And I will just start by saying that members of the Baha'i faith come from a lot of different backgrounds, and we are in a lot of different professions. And the background is really important because we have members of the Baha'i faith who come from the South, from the North. We have Persian background, we have Mexican, and we have African American. And I happen to come from a state, South Carolina, where quite a few members of the African American community really began to notice the Baha'i faith in the 1960s. And I probably earlier than that, in the early 1900s, you began to see small communities of Baha'is forming in that state. And part of the reason, by the time I was born and growing up during that decade that you're talking about, that I noticed them is that they were one of the few communities, religious communities, that met together interracially and that seemed to be governed by principles of the oneness of humanity, which I think Hoda has very well explained just now. So I have to give this context. So I grew up in this town, Orangeburg, which was a bastion of Jim Crow Southern segregation. And there was a certain contradiction within religious people's communities in that area of the country, and that was that everybody was Christian. So I grew up in a place where there were lots and lots of churches, but they were only Black churches on one side of town and white churches on the other side of town. And there was a systematic policy of oppression that we sometimes call Jim Crow segregation, that manifested itself in terms of white and colored signs, in terms of economic oppression, in terms of purposefully inferior public education. So when you describe this particular incident, what you're describing is really just a linchpin. It's just a day that kind of helps us understand this coming together of these contradictions in the form of African American college students, two of whom I knew because it was not that big a town, being confronted by the dominant culture, the white state troopers, who without any warning, no warning shots, no megaphone, nothing, they fired upon these students that had been protesting a segregated bowling alley. That was the origin of the conflict. These were demonstrators who had been protesting a segregated bowling alley. I'm repeating that because now it sounds so ridiculous that that would be the cause of death and injuries, but that was the case. So when I consider the influence on my own view of religion, you have to understand that basic contradiction that we have for many, many decades, for centuries in this country. We have actually facilitated the bifurcation of the dominant religion, which is Christianity, through the active suppression of one set of adherents to this religion by another set of adherents to this religion. So this had a major effect. You know, I sometimes read now about some researchers have talked about the lifelong effects of trauma on people who experience this kind of violence and this kind of suppression. So I was recently talking with one of my elementary school classmates, I think it was like last week, and she said, you know, I still haven't gotten over that. She was on campus that day. I still haven't gotten over that. So this is really, I think, a perfect illustration of what Hoda, Dr. Mahmoudi was saying, that we have this situation that is in need of some rectification. We can't continue to have peace in the world when these kinds of incidents take place and when we continue to have racial justice. So this was just one of a series of events in my whole childhood that led me to become a seeker of some other religion. And many other African Americans, particularly in my home state, were also seeking some other religion, because while we were very well supported by our Black churches, which did a terrific job of trying to help raise the children and the youth under a system of oppression, still this contradiction of white Christians who were actively oppressing us and had no complaint, they really didn't seem guilty, or, there didn't seem to be any concept that this was a flawed ideology. This led to active seeking. And so that's just one day. And then, later, if we have time, I can talk about the confrontation of desegregation, but it made it clear that we needed to think about a new religious ethos. We needed to look at new ways of thinking, not because what His Holiness Jesus Christ said was not right, because he himself talked about the brotherhood of humanity, but somehow that message had gotten diluted and fragmented. And so it was necessary for my own well-being to look for a religion where that message was not diluted and fragmented. And it was a few years after that incident that I found the Baha'i faith.
And remind me, you were given an award, or you were in some way recognized by President Johnson, yes?
Yeah. Yeah. My husband found a broken, fragmented photo of that opportunity and had it refixed by someone. And so he put it up on our wall. And so now everybody knows. But yeah, so one of the ways that, my parents did file lawsuit with other parents for the NAACP under the auspices of the NAACP and Legal Defense Fund. And that led to basically a court order, which sent me into the white high school as one of the first Black people to enter that high school. And in order to survive, because it was such a horrible situation of ostracism and harassment and actually verbal and physical attacks, in order to survive, I studied my heart out. And basically this led to good things. And so I became a National Merit Scholar finalist and a presidential scholar, which there were 2 in the state. And so I was sent to Washington, D.C. And so, yes, I did receive this award. And then I sort of kept the picture. My father kept the picture, but then my husband found it, and now it's on the wall and the world knows.
Well, we thank you for your service. We thank you for your activism. We thank you for being such a hero to so many people. Thank you. Thank you for being you. I think this takes us to the next point. Baha'i teachings condemn violence of all kind, whether it's physical, psychological, sexual, economic, patrimonial, symbolic, gender-based, all kinds, domestic, institutional, workplace violence, media violence, and the list can go on and on. The Baha'i teachings condemn violence of all kind. Dr. Stockman, as I'm sitting here with you, I'm also thinking about Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama.
Yeah.
And I so appreciated the type of interaction they had with each other. It might make you uncomfortable and might make me uncomfortable if we started petting each other like they do.
But they did.
But
Yeah.
how beautiful that was, two people of different faith traditions.
Mhm.
Not only were they coming together, but they were setting the stage and the foundation for so many other people to come together.
Right.
And they certainly were two people who condemned all acts of violence. And I wonder if you can speak to the Baha'is community's commitment, number one, to social change, but particularly, what does the Baha'i faith have to offer? What do they offer to combat and condemn violence?
Well, we've already heard quite a lot from both Hoda and June about the Baha'i concept of the oneness of humanity. And for many people, the idea of the oneness of humanity sounds like a nice idea, but for Baha'is, it has very clear ethical imperatives, and I think we've also gotten some sense of that from the comments by June and Hoda as well. And I'll give an example. When Abdu'l-Baha, the son of the founder, came to the United States in 1912, he spoke in Boston twice, and the host of his second talk in Boston said, he talked a lot about the oneness of humanity the other day, and isn't it marvelous to know that an Iranian man believes the same thing we believe? At the same time Abdu'l-Baha was talking about the oneness of humanity, he was also encouraging Louis Gregory, an African-American lawyer, to consider marrying a white woman. And this was the first interracial marriage in the Baha'i community. It happened in September, maybe also September 30th, but I'm not sure of the exact date, 1912. And for the next 40 years, they were this presence, interracial presence in the American Baha'i community. And the American Baha'is, and some of them were shocked by the idea, well, we understand the oneness of humanity, but we're not really ready for this. Well, they had to be. And of course, from that followed many other interracial marriages. So there has been a very strong emphasis on trying to demonstrate the Baha'i teachings within the Baha'i community itself. Sometimes that means making choices. When the Baha'is, for example, in South Africa, were told that they could no longer elect racially mixed governing bodies because our Baha'i communities are run by what's called a local assembly. The local assembly is elected by the Baha'is of the local community, and these elections occur without any mention of names, any campaigning, or any nominations. The Baha'is were told they could no longer elect multiracial governing bodies, and so the Universal House of Justice said, fine, only elect Black people to it. And so all the white Baha'is were voting for the Black members, and the Black members ran the Baha'i faith in South Africa during apartheid. That was the way we responded to that particular injustice, by demonstrating the principle of the oneness of humanity that way. And there are many, many examples of things Baha'is have been doing around the world that are like that. Even in Iran, where the Baha'is are badly persecuted, over 200 of them have been killed over the last 40 years for their faith. Thousands have been thrown in prison. Tens of thousands have left the country, fled the persecution. But the Baha'is there have an underground university, it's so-called the Baha'i Institute for Higher Education. And the purpose of BIHE is to provide the Baha'is with education to serve their country. So for example, they've been working on a bachelor's degree or a master's degree in drug counseling, because Iran has serious problems with drugs. And you can't get an education easily in Iran on that. And if a Baha'i has that education, even from BIHE, they might be able to be employed because the government has such a shortage. So these are the kinds of things Baha'is have been doing to make our principles clear. We try to demonstrate them whatever way we can in a nonviolent and peaceful way. And, in some cases, Baha'is have been killed for standing up for their principles as well.
Everybody is very much aware of the war that is happening in Ukraine. War undermines the legitimacy of a given state. It threatens its institutions. It threatens security of property ownership, and it threatens the general rule of law. Moreover, it can destroy human life. So many people have lost their lives due to war in the 20th and 21st century, and we continue to see people's lives destroyed in Ukraine. Dr. Mahmoudi, you wrote, "World society faces immediate and long-term threats to peace and security." I have three questions for you, and I'm glad to ask them again if need be. But first of all, from your advantage point, what are the fundamental challenges to global peace and security? That's the first one. The fundamental challenges to global peace and security. Secondly, what can we do now? What can we do now to eliminate those challenges to global peace and security? Because this is a problem that we have now. And finally, in your view, how does the war in Ukraine affect global peace and security?
Okay.
It's loaded.
I think
And you
those
have
are,
5 minutes.
yes, I know. I think those are very important questions, especially in the world that we live in at this very moment. First of all, the challenges to global peace and security are so many, but I'm going to list a few. Proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, human rights violations, racial and gender inequality, crimes against humanity, terrorism, the spread of hateful ideologies, sex trafficking, mass migration, financial inequality, degradation of the natural environment. And then there's also the problem of global systems of production and trade themselves, which are in crisis because of the imperative for constant growth and unequal rewards from wealth creation. Some nations have a lot, other nations have very little. There is no system in place which brings about any form of equality or justice among the nations of the world. Certain countries will, because they can afford, will buy minerals and other goods from the poor nations, I would say under very corrupt conditions and not paying enough. And yet those poor nations are not really reimbursed for the kinds of services that they provide for the rest of the world. So the system is really quite broken. There is massive unemployment, underemployment, and as we encroach on agriculture and on the environment, we are also beginning to see frequent pandemics that come from that kind of closeness to nature and animals and all of that. So there are many, many challenges to peace and security in the world. Now, how can we eliminate those challenges to global peace and security? I'm going to try to be as quick as I can, but this is an extremely important question. I think the institutions that we have presently in this world, including the nation state, the United Nations, the NGOs, the international legal system, everything that is part of what we call the international system of governance, I think that too is broken. Our world is shrinking. Our interdependence is so interwoven that there is really nothing we can do to undo this. Even though it's tried in many places, it's at the detriment of whoever tries to get out of this system of global trade and governance and all that. And I would say that because of this interdependence and interwovenness, we don't have institutions that are capable of dealing with how this system should function properly, so that first we address the equitable nature of how do we distribute the resources of the planet equitably to all countries and all peoples. Secondly, how do we then create institutions that are able to actually prevent wars as soon as possible, as soon as there is an aggressor, how to stop the belligerent party from waging war. You know, my fear is, because let me just tell you, we had World War I and the League of Nations emerged. Fine, that was a very good step, but the League of Nations failed. And then we had the Second World War and the United Nations emerged. Fine, wonderful. But now we are how many years out? 70 some years out since the founding of the UN. And look at the war in Ukraine. Where is the UN? Now, I'm not trying to be too negative here, but UN has been trying to use, you know, the Security Council, its Human Rights Council, other councils to deal with the war in Ukraine. But really, it is not enough. It is way too passive. And here we are a year out, and the Ukrainians continue to be, you know, the aggressor is continuing to plummet that country. And we see the millions, I think upwards of 8 million people have been, are now refugees that have left Ukraine, some close to 7 million inside of Ukraine have been displaced. You know, these, where is the world? Where is the world? Why isn't there more rallying as to how to put an end to this horrific war? That wasn't even, you know, it was totally on the part of one nation deciding that they need to take over Ukraine. And so I think the problem is, and I hate to say what I'm about to say, but I wonder if it will take another crisis like a World War II, God forbid a World War III, to awaken the world, the leaders of the nations, the various organizations around the world, the peoples of the world, awaken us to realize that the current system of global governance, the current system of just pure national sovereignty is not going to work. We need a global international system, global in nature, not national, global, that can address this very, very important issue about the future of the peace and security of humanity. And I have to tell you that Baha'u'llah early on wrote to the leaders of the world and actually told them, in fact, it was to Queen Victoria that he wrote and said, the leaders of the world must come together, draw up treaties, draw up laws, and find a way to collectively respond to the crises that will occur in the world, especially to war, so that it doesn't emerge into a larger problem, larger conflict. I think right now, you know, countries in the world, you know, nuclear weapons have come into the discussions among certain nations in relation to Ukraine, but in particular Russia. I mean, these are very difficult, serious times. And to continue with the system that we have at present is simply not going to work. So for Baha'is, I think they see the concept of a federation of nations, similar to the US, but not exactly. I don't know what it'll look like, but I know that it will need something beyond the United Nations to deal with the legal issues, with the border issues, with war, with the distribution of resources, because we are no longer the continent of North America, the continent of Africa, the continent of Asia. We are now the United Nations of the world. We are now a global community, but our thinking, our institutions, our structures are very much, I would say, more than a century old. In some ways, they go back to Westphalia, which was in the 1600s, for crying out loud. So peace and security will not come about until there is a radical change in the global order, a radical shift in how we envision a world that has become interdependent.
So I also teach interreligious dialogue at Holy Cross College at Notre Dame, and particularly Muslim Christian dialogue. And I raised this question with my students. It is often said that religion is the problem But if religion is the problem, might it also be the solution? And I think you're arguing that it very well is at least one of the solutions. It plays a big role in this. But within the Baha'i community, how is it that you connect with your community all over the world? How do you rally your community together on these very important issues? And that's a question really for any of you, but how does that happen?
Well, you heard that we have the Universal House of Justice, which is the governing council of the entire Baha'i world. But at every level, from the local to regional to national, we have democratically elected councils. And these are made up of the rank and file of the Baha'i community. And they are elected annually, usually. In the case of the House of Justice, it's elected every 5 years. Now, the way the Baha'is communicate is through this is our administrative order, if I may call it that. That's what we refer to it as. And so these institutions are constantly in touch with each other. I don't want to go into too many of the details, but the Universal House of Justice establishes plans. These are what we call divine plans for how the Baha'i community can continue its society building efforts in the world. And then that communication is transferred down to the national level, to the regional level, and to the local level, where there is constant communication between the institutions of the Baha'i faith. I don't want to go into it. There's also an appointed side to these institutions, which is a part of the system. But the communication is very much unified around plans that have been established by the House of Justice, and that the Baha'is act on those plans, which are all based on the teachings of Baha'u'llah. They are all based on the teachings of Baha'u'llah and given to the Baha'i community based on the assessment that the House of Justice makes. Here's the component of science and religion being in harmony. Assessments that the House makes of how much has the Baha'i community progressed globally, and what are the challenges that it needs to face, and how will it then now move ahead? What are the goals that it needs to address in order to move forward?
Yeah, thank you for that. Two books that Dr. Mahmoudi has written that you might be interested in reading. I mentioned them earlier: A World Without War and Fundamental Challenges to Global Peace and Security. It's hard to believe, but Religion in 60 Minutes is going to be coming to an end before long. I want to get to one more question and then allow just a few moments for some reflection. But this question is for Dr. Thomas, and it has to do with redevelopment and race. Redevelopment and race. You wrote a book about it. Many good people are working to expose and eradicate systemic racism in our government institutions, in our schools, in our police departments, in our religious institutions, urban planning, and so on and so forth. As you already mentioned, you were born and raised in South Carolina during the Jim Crow years, and you saw firsthand how systemic racism entraps so many Black Americans. How does your faith influence your research, your writings, and your activism as it relates to redevelopment and race? Moreover, tell us, if you would, what led you to write your book, Redevelopment and Race, Planning a Finer City in Post-War Detroit? And I can say, living here in South Bend, Indiana, we are still very much a racially divided city. We see it in Gary, Indiana, and other parts of the country. So if you could speak to this for a few moments.
Well, first, just to bridge to Hoda's wonderful remarks, I think it's such a stunning vision that she offered to us, this idea of global peace and how do we reach global peace. Many of us have diverse professions and we have diverse points of interest. So my focus is usually much smaller, a state or a hometown, and as we just discussed. or a city. So my field is urban planning, but the same general principles that she described would apply to a city, that where there is, for example, segmentation, where there is injustice, then we need to think about what is needed for social reform. So what the Baha'i faith gives me and other people in their own fields, and particularly other scholars, is permission to enter public discourse. That is, to enter conversations about what social reform means, guided by the Baha'i teachings and the Baha'i principles. And so these principles, fortunately, I became a Baha'i when I was 20 years old, 21 years old, I think. And so my whole career has been influenced by these very principles. So when I realized my interest in this field, urban planning, then it became clear that I needed to apply those principles to that field. Two very important principles are racial unity, as we've already described, or the oneness of humanity, and justice. That's one we haven't mentioned yet. But justice is another of the two major concepts that we see as underlying the Baha'i framework for action. And so I left South Carolina, I came to Michigan, I married a Detroit man, which meant that I married into a Detroit family, and immediately became aware of the injustices and the segmentation. It's almost as if my experience growing up in South Carolina gave me a unique lens with which to view what I was seeing in Detroit. And so I actually began to be concerned about my nieces and nephews, my in-laws, my mother-in-law. What were their lives like? How had racism affected their lives? What was redevelopment doing to my community, to their community? What was it doing in terms of racial injustice to the Black community? And that's what I wrote about in that book, Redevelopment and Race. But notice the subtitle. The subtitle is Planning a Finer City in Post-War Detroit. And there you see the influence of the Baha'i faith, because even then, in speaking of racism, I talked about a finer city. What's a better city? And what should that look like?
We have just a moment for some questions or thoughts. Yes. Do we have a microphone? Okay, here comes a microphone.
Hi, Alawa Pa for the Baha'is here. I'm a member of the Baha'i faith, actually. I go to Notre Dame Law School. I wasn't prepared to talk on the microphone today, but I just have a quick bit of commentary. I was so excited that this event was taking place. I just found out about it last night, and the Ansari Institute, so I'm so thankful for everyone putting this together today and being able to be here. I think one of the most important things to me just about being a Baha'i is that I think that, I mean, even as someone as a law student, I studied anthropology at UCLA. I worked with Dr. Nader Saidi, who translates a lot of documentation of Baha'i text and writing, that the Baha'i faith is really unique in that what's happening in the Ukraine is so devastating and awful, but the fact is that there is war everywhere in the world. There's a women's rights revolution currently happening in Iran that doesn't get the recognition that I think that it deserves on a global scale. I think that the Baha'i faith is really unique in that we address problems systematically, but also in really small sets too, that we understand that we have to educate people on a small scale as well as a grand scale. But my question for Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi, as well as everyone else here, is kind of, you touched a little bit about how we're kind of pushing away from this nationalistic ideal that we kind of saw during some of the world wars, and that now that we're kind of getting into a new standard of being able to view the world on a global scale. And I was wondering, you're talking a little bit about that we need, a new radical ideal of organizations to help support this new system. Do you think that there are ways within the current systems that we have right now within the UN to kind of incorporate this globalistic ideal, or not really?
And apologies, Tim, are we able to take about 3 more minutes? Okay, so we have about 3 more minutes, so please.
Very quickly, I think that if the UN were to radically reform itself to address the problems of the world today, of course, we are moving in the right direction. But I don't see that happening because many of the things that need to happen are already in the UN Charter, and it hasn't happened. So I think we need something. There needs to be a will. And you mentioned nationalism. I think nationalism is once again on the rise. Again, these are the prejudices that I mentioned earlier. Nationalism on the rise. Fragmentation is increasing in the world. So obviously our current systems are not working.
Thank you for your question. Good to have someone from Notre Dame Law School with us as well. One more question. Oh, here we go. Okay.
Where does the concept of forgiveness fit into all of this? And it seems that unless we decide almost globally, at least in substantial groups, to forgive the past and start moving forward on a clean basis, we're not going to get anywhere if we keep looking backwards, because this is ingrained in us, and we've got to find some way to incorporate a fantastic concept of forgiveness.
Were you able to hear the question? Where does forgiveness come in? Okay.
I'm going to quickly say one thing and then shut up. I want to say that change in the world moves at the pace of the human heart. And if the heart is loving, interested in justice, caring for others, I think then, of course, we will see a better world emerge.
Okay. Well, the time has come. Religion in 60 minutes is now religion in 62 minutes. Well, thank you all for being here with us today on behalf of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion and our co-sponsors, the University of Notre Dame's Clow Institute for Civil and Human Rights and the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies, as well as the Department of American Studies. Thank you for joining us. Esteemed scholars and friends, Dr. Stockman, Dr. Thomas, and Dr. Mahmoudi, all of you have enriched our lives with your time, with your scholarship, with your experiences, with your knowledge, and with your wisdom. Thank you. You cannot see everyone that is in the room, but on their behalf, thank you for this contribution that you have made. And I also want to thank Marcy Hull, who is our temporary office coordinator, who helped order the food and set the food up in the back, and also Tim Checkley, our audio visual professional. Again, thank you all for being here. I'm Charles Powell. Goodbye.